It's always important to pay attention in school. You want to do well and you want to get a good grade, but you also want to always expand your horizons when it comes to learning. Unfortunately, some of the most interesting facts throughout history aren't taught in our public schools. In today's video, we'll go over some of the top and most interesting facts that aren't taught in history class. Ready to join the finest squad? Then make sure to subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss any of our interesting videos ever again. That being said, let's begin. Bathroom toiletry. Part of fighting in a bloody battle in history meant that there were few rules and it was a bloody battle. However, even during some of our most inhumane moments as society, we still had rules, even for the battlefield. In the American Civil War, both sides had a rule for attacking, and they weren't allowed to attack someone even if they were on the opposite side of you if they were using the bathroom as a toilet. Well, that's rather nice of them, don't you think? Could you imagine getting ready to go into battle and having to wait because someone's going number 1 or 2? That's right, actually. The battle would cease to a halt sometimes if anyone had to use the bathroom. That's something they don't teach you in history books or in history class, period. It's actually reported that one of the written rules actually said it was forbade while attending to the imperative calls of nature. Other than that, people didn't really have many rules for each other during the war, as it was an all-out bloodbath at every time other than this. Curing syphilis with mercury. We know from the title alone, you're probably thinking, what in the world? One thing that we feel is left out a lot in history class and from history lessons in general is pirates. Public education doesn't do nearly enough to educate you on pirates. They are by far some of the most interesting people in history, and their lawlessness should be studied way more than some of our other boring wars that were fought on soil. Well, on the ocean, a lot of people were susceptible to diseases because drinking rum and being away from land for months at a time apparently wasn't healthy. Not only that, but a lot of pirates would engage in unhealthy sexual activities, which led them to develop even more diseases. At one point, it's reported that syphilis on ships was an epidemic, and researchers needed to do something fast. So the pirates feel like they had found a solution. They started injecting real mercury into the groins of people who were suffering. Yeah, we're 100% serious. Not only did this not work, but it had serious side effects, and it wasn't long before they stopped doing this and presumably tried literally anything else. Roman charioteers were rich. Rome is such a fascinating culture, and we'll never understand all there is to know about Rome. An empire with so much power and so much strength developed so many of today's architectural breakthroughs that we still use today. However, there's one thing in Rome that a lot of people don't talk about, and that's the charioteers. They're kind of like the horse racers of today, but to a much more extreme degree. Now, we'd like to discuss football players because they kind of tie into this discussion. When you think of football players today, you think of people who get paid to kick a ball around on the field and they make millions of dollars doing it. However, did you know that charioteers during the Roman Empire were actually the football players of their time? That's right. In the Roman Empire standards of their time, the charioteers were actually paid more than the people who play football today if you adjust the currency. Would you become a charioteer for fortune and fame knowing how dangerous it was? Russian dogs. War is absolute hell, especially during World War II when every country was pulling out every stop that they could and they were trying to find any way they possibly could to gain an advantage. During World War II, someone in Russia thought it was a good idea to start training dogs. They weren't just ordinary dogs, they were trying to train dogs to actually blow up German tanks. There was just one problem. These dogs couldn't distinguish the difference between the Russian tanks and the German tanks, so they were setting bombs up under any tanks they found. Unfortunately for the Russians, the dogs were setting bombs up under their own tanks, blowing up Russian tanks instead of German tanks. Obviously, this was a failed experiment and a large waste of money on the part of the Russian government, but no one ever talks about it in textbooks. If you do some searching, you can find some pictures of Russian dogs with bombs strapped to them that are actually running towards tanks. And they were actually blowing up Russian tanks more often than they were blowing up German tanks, so they had to call off the entire program. The Drunk Rebellion. For this story, we have to go all the way back to 1917. When you think about overthrowing an entire government party, you probably don't worry about your troops getting too drunk to function, but that is exactly what happened when the Bolsheviks decided they were going to overthrow the government around this time. Around 1917, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace and decided to take over the local government. They weren't happy with how things were going, so they wanted to take things over. They were taking over the government and starting a new life, but however, their progress halted for a few days. It's for a reason that you probably would never think of happening. The Bolsheviks actually got so drunk that they couldn't perform their natural duties. They ended up finding some wine stores within the palace, and they just ended up drinking all the time, becoming alcoholics, which greatly stopped their progress. Can you imagine having an entire revolutionary army under your command and they can no longer function or do their duties because they end up getting drunk? This is something that was never reported within textbooks and something that no one ever talks about, but this most definitely happened in 1917. President Bush's bad sushi. I'm sure a lot of people know about the infamous incident involving George Bush and some really bad sushi. Back when the original George Bush was president in 1992, he was sitting down with the Prime Minister of Japan going over some political foreign affairs. During the middle of his dinner, however, his stomach disagreed with whatever he was eating, and he proceeded to vomit all over himself. Then he proceeded to vomit on the Prime Minister of Japan. We don't know if textbooks leave this out because it's an embarrassing mishap or because teachers genuinely just don't want to gross other students out, but we feel it's an important lesson in humility. The Japanese didn't really take offense to it though, and they actually laughed it off. They made up a new word in spite of this event called bushashuru. This simply translated to doing the Bush thing, which isn't really meant to be an insult by any means, but it's still funny to this day. The President and the KKK. When it comes to the KKK, it's probably best for your political career if you are nowhere near those people, as it tends to give you a bad reputation, for good reason. However, the 33rd President of the United States didn't quite see it that way. When Harry S. Truman was in office, he was actually paying the way of the KKK and was offering to pay for people's fee to join. No, seriously, this was a real thing that happened. However, it's probably not in the same way that you think it is. Truman's college professor was an innocent-looking man and there really wasn't much to him. However, his nice appearance hid the fact that he was actually trying to join the Klan. Once his college professor needed $10 to join, Harry Truman obliged and gave his professor $10. However, then he found out what the $10 was all about and he declined to join the KKK. So while it really did happen, it's not as bad as you think. Al Capone. Sure, you might learn a little bit about Al Capone throughout history, such as his run-ins with law enforcement and his life of crime, but what you haven't heard of is the most shocking fact about him. Al Capone actually had contracted an STD. When he was at the height of his career during his mob workings, he was arrested for tax evasion, which is one of the most serious crimes you can commit in America. You don't rob money from Uncle Sam. It's worse than murder. He even contracted syphilis at one point, but when doctors told him he had the STD, he was defiant at first. Then, when they tried to treat him, he simply wouldn't allow the doctors to treat him because he had a fear of needles and didn't know what was in the needles. When doctors tried to come up with remedies and alternative methods of treatment, they ultimately failed, and his brain was rapidly rotting away due to the STD that he refused to let doctors treat. He ultimately died from the disease in 1947 in his home while he was surrounded by his family. Einstein had a memory problem. It's hard to imagine that Albert Einstein had a memory problem because he had so many things up in his head all the time. He could come up with some of the most advanced theories that most humans even today cannot comprehend. His teachings and his findings were absolutely brilliant. It's even proposed in one theory that he came close to finding the speed of light, which would allow us to bend the time around us and actually travel through time. However, he became so scared of his finding and what people might do with it that he scrapped his plans and made sure they never saw the light of day. However, this is just a rumor and we'll never know if that's actually true or not. One day, he had to call his own office and ask where he lived. He had to ask for his own address. The secretary, thinking it was a prank or an obsessed stalker, refused to give it out, and Albert eventually had to confess that it was him and he forgot his own address. Yeah, this actually happened. The U.S. Postal Service. Look, working at the U.S. Postal Service is a very stressful job. There's a reason that the terminology for losing your mind is going postal, because people who work in that job are sitting there all day at a conveyor belt just counting the mail that doesn't stop coming. Imagine envelopes and packages that just don't stop coming 24/7. It would be enough to drive almost anyone insane. However, the US Postal Service has done their own share of insane things. For a while, they were actually confiscating sexual toys. Yes, for a brief period of time, they were actually confiscating toys that people were buying and sending to themselves or a friend. This during the 1880s, when apparently this kind of stuff was prohibited for some reason. It's reported that the Postal Service actually seized over 65,000 pounds of stuff that it called immoral goods. Imagine the kind of things that US postal workers see today. Do you think history books should be more open about the things that happen in history? Also, check out our other cool stuff showing up on screen right now. See you next time.